due to COVID-19, and as such may be eligible to deduct home office expenses. These claims are usually complicated, but because of COVID-19, the government has put in some new rules just for the year 2020. Again, please keep that in mind. This is just for the year 2020. They have not pronounced themselves for the year 2021, but I know that there's quite a few people that have still been working from home. So these rules only apply for 2020. The presentation is going to be short because this topic is very specific and it's only for the year 2020, and it only covers home office expenses, which I think in previous years, most of you were not eligible for. So this year is a very particular year for everybody that has been working from home. And this is going to give us more time to address your questions at the end. Again, every situation is going to be in particular and different. So therefore, as we're answering the questions, it may cover another participant's questions, so we can then remove those questions. So if we turn to slide number 2. So on the agenda today, there are 2 claim methods. Who can claim? How can you claim? We have to determine your workspace use, the expenses that you'll be able to claim, and calculating your expenses. Now, before we continue, we're going to be reviewing the CRA, which is the Revenue Canada legislation, but Quebec has harmonized this deduction. So everything that is allowed for the federal government will be allowed on your provincial tax return. What I will do is when we get to the forms that you have to complete for the federal, I will give you the equivalent form that has to be prepared on the provincial level. But everything else is harmonized, so therefore what is applicable for one is applicable for the other. So home office rules are quite specific. These rules have not changed, but CRA has introduced administrative concessions to these rules. Those employees who worked at home before the pandemic should follow the detailed method. So therefore, if any of you were on the detailed method in previous years because you were working from home, this webinar is not for you. This webinar is really for the people that have been working from home due to the pandemic. If we turn to slide 3. So there are 2 methods. There's what they call the temporary flat rate method. This is a method that was introduced just for COVID-19. And then there's the detailed method. Turn to the next slide, please. So both cases follow the same conditions. These conditions must be met in 2020 for you to be able to use one or the other. Those conditions are that you worked from home in 2020 due to the pandemic or were required to work at home by your employer. So whether you chose to work from home, or whether you were required to work from home by your employer, that's one of the conditions. The second condition, which is the more important one, is that you worked from home more than 50% of the time for at least 4 consecutive weeks in that year. So what that means is in a period of 4 weeks, you can pick whichever period it was, you must have worked from home for 4 consecutive weeks and more than 50% of the time. So I'll give you an example. If you worked 2 days from home and 3 days from the office, you are not eligible for this deduction because you are at 40%. If you work 3 days from home and 2 days at the office, then you are eligible. So the 50% rule is very, very specific, and you must meet that rule for you to be able to have this, to claim this deduction. We turn the page. The temporary flat rate method. So on the temporary flat rate method, it allows eligible employees, again, those employees that met the conditions on the previous page, to claim a deduction of $2 a day, which they worked at home in 2020 due to COVID-19, up to a maximum of $400. That means 200 days, you're allowed up to 200 days to have worked from home. This is a flat amount, the $2 a day. So this amount is a substitute for the actual home expense, office expenses that you paid. So you would not declare rent, electricity, internet access fees, office supplies, nothing else. You are only allowed to this $2 a day. And you're going to see later on, as we go along, it might be the best method for everyone. If we go to the next page, which is slide 6. So this deduction is limited, but there's advantages to it. So there will be no form T2200 that has to be prepared by your employer. Now, and you do not need to determine and summarize your eligible costs or keep any of the records. You don't have to keep your heating costs, your telephone costs, none of that. You're allowed to $2 a day. What's very important is that you need to keep track of those days that you worked from home. So you should have a little agenda detailing the days that you worked from home, more than 50% of the time for the 4-week period. That's going to be very important, plus the rest of the days that you worked from home. If, Janine, you can put up the slide with the T777. So now this form must be completed. This one here, you complete it on your tax return, or your tax preparer will complete it for you. And if you look at the T77, option 1, which is the one that for the temporary flat rate method, you will see that it asks you the total number of days you worked from home times $2. And that'll give you the amount that you're allowed to deduct on line 22,900. And line 22,900 is the other employment expenses on your personal tax return on the federal side. On the provincial side, it's line 207. And you need to tick that you're using this method. Now, if we go back to the presentation and we go to slide 7. Slide 7 is where people opt not to use the temporary flat rate method, and they want to use the detailed method. So now the detailed method states that you can claim employment portion of your actual home office expenses that you have paid. So for those of you that will opt not to use the temporary flat rate method, you're allowed to use what we call the detailed method. And this is the method that has been used in the past by people who actually work from home, by commissioned employees. This has not changed. So you can claim employment portion of actual home office expenses that you paid. Then in 2020, the rules have been simplified, but the calculations are essentially the same as for those in the prior years. Now, the form T2200 is a form that has to be obtained from the university. So we're not going to put it up yet. We will put it up at the end, but this form has to be furnished to the employees that want to use their actual home office expenses, and the university has to issue the forms. You must have a form T2200S from your employer if you're going to use the detailed method. If your employer refuses to give you one, you cannot use the detailed method. You can use the simplified method. Now, you're going to have to determine your workspace use. So the employees must first determine the portion of their home used for work based on both size and use, employment versus usual. So if you use the common space, let's do the easy part first. Let's say you live in an apartment and it's a 2-bedroom apartment. You live alone, and one room is an office. You have to measure the full size of your apartment. Then you have to measure the space of your office, and that is the percentage that you can use for office use. Again, the government may start to question if you want to use the full rate. So let's say that your office space is 10% of your whole apartment. If you want to use 10% of all your expenses, such as rent, utilities, and so forth, the government may want to question that, because what's going to happen is that you're using 10% of all your expenses, but the government might say, listen, you're not using it. Every other year, you have not been using it as an office just for work. So that's something that might come up in an audit. Now, if you're using a common space, that makes things a bit more complicated. So if we go to slide 8, on slide 8, if you're using a common space, such as a kitchen table or a dining room table where you also have lunch and you sit, so if you have a smaller apartment, you have to determine, first of all, what that space is, the actual space that you're using for business. So if you're using a kitchen, you cannot use the full kitchen. You're going to have to use the table and the maybe a few feet around the table. And then you have to do a calculation and say, how many hours do you work a week? So if you're on a 30-hour work week, there are 168 hours in a week. So you have to do 30 divided by 168. And that says that 17.86% of your common space is being used for business. Then you have to take that common space, which is the square footage that you're using, over the total space of the house. So if you have 100 square feet that you're using of common space on a 1,000 square foot apartment, that's 10%. And then you have to apply the 17.6% to the 10%. So you will only be allowed 1.786% of your expenses for office use. So that's why when I was saying that in most cases, the temporary flat rate method will be better than using the detail space, the detail calculation. We've had examples where there are more than one, when there's more than one person working from home. You cannot each use the full detail calculation. So what that means is now you're using 1.786%. If there's two of you working from home, you have to share this expense. And you have to decide how you're going to share it. So it's, while on the temporary flat rate method, you would both definitely be able to use the $2 a day. So that's why it might be more advantageous. Also, some of you have children that have been doing homeschooling. So that too falls into the calculation. So the detail method is very complex and may not be advantageous. Now, if we go to the next slide, to determine your workspace, if you Google, CRA has a whole bunch of examples on their website. And if you Google determining your workspace use, you're going to come up with a list of places. Go to the one where it says www.canada.ca, and you can look at the different situations and see if your particular situation is there. I went through it, and I can guarantee you that most cases have been attacked by the government and looked at so that they can be able to determine how much space is actually being used in total. Now, if we turn to slide 10. So what expenses can you claim? Now, I've given a document which we're going to go over at the end. Once we get to slide 13, we'll bring that document up right away. And you will see that the eligible expenses for home office are not very big. You do not have a lot of expenses that you're allowed to, because you are falling under the old rules for that, and therefore they have not changed that. And somebody who is not a commissioned employee, usually commissioned employees have a lot more deductions, but somebody who is not a commissioned employee, does not have too many deductions that they're allowed to. So what are some of the eligible expenses? Office supplies, electricity, heat and water, your home internet access fees, just the access fees. You will see that your connection fees, so if you run in the internet, the fees that you pay to get connected to the internet are not deductible. Minor repairs and minor maintenance to your apartment or your house, and rent. Again, remember that these expenses are eligible expenses, but again, based on the percentage. So might be 10%, could be 1.78% of the total of the expenses, because these are common fees. These are, you're still paying rent to live in your apartment, you're still paying for internet, you're still paying for electricity, heat, and water. So the only expense that you may have at 100% would be office supplies. If you had to purchase specific pencils, and again, office supplies are minor supplies. I was asked by another group, if we had to purchase a computer screen, the answer is no. If we had to purchase a laptop, the answer is no. And you will see that on that document I've given you. If we go to the next slide, which is the non-eligible expenses. So someone who owns their home is at a disadvantage. Your mortgage interest is not deductible. Your principal repayment is not deductible. Home internet connection fees, like I said before, not deductible. Furniture, if you had to buy office chairs and buy a desk, not deductible. Capital expenses on your house, windows, floors, building walls, not deductible. Computers, monitors, and printers, not deductible. So again, the association has been given a list. It's part of the presentation, so you can, I'm sure they'll make it accessible for you to look at, but you will see that you do not have that much of eligible expenses. So if we turn to slide 12, please, I don't make the rules, so don't shoot the messenger. I know that I did one other presentation, and people were very upset with me because I was telling them that their monitors, their computers, their laptops were not deductible. The rules for people who are not commissioned employees are very particular and very specific. And even though they've made some concessions for the year 2020, these rules have not changed as to what is eligible and what is not eligible. So which method to use is a case-by-case basis. If you own a house, the expenses are much less than if you're a renter. If there's more than one of you working from home, you need to share expenses on the detailed method, while on the flat rate, you can both use the flat rate. So I would say 99% of the time, if there's two of you working from home, the $400 for 200 days will definitely be more advantageous for you. So you may want to, before you ask your employer for the T2200, you may want to do a quick calculation to see if the flat rate method is better for you, and then don't even go ahead, don't even ask for the form. If you're using a common space, I would say 999 cases out of 100, it's not advantageous. You're better with the $2 a day flat rate method. If we go to the last slide. So the last slide is which method is simpler and costs less. The flat rate method is very simple and will definitely cost you a lot less. So if you're using a tax preparer, no matter which tax preparer you're using, whether you use H&R Block, a CPA, or anybody you have to pay, using the detailed method, they will charge you a lot more, because they have to fill out the form. They have to complete a whole list of questions on their questionnaire before they complete your tax return, and therefore you will be charged for it. So you should take that into consideration, because that is an after-tax dollar cost to you, while this $400 deduction and the detailed method is not a dollar for dollar tax credit, but it's a deduction, and this deduction is applicable to your rate, your tax rate. So you're not getting $400 tax credits, tax saving. You may get a $150 tax saving on it. So you may be spending a lot more on your tax preparer just to do the detailed form. The other problem with the detailed method, the detailed method is going to open the door to an audit from CRA. You need to understand that COVID-19 has given a whole bunch of benefits to a whole bunch of people. The government has given out a lot of money, but we have heard in the grapevine that they are going to be doing a lot of audits, not just on this, but on everything else. On the CERB, which is the $2,000 a month that people have received, on the SUS, which is the wage subsidies. So any money that the government has dished out, they will definitely go back and start looking at whether people took advantage of the rules. So on a detailed method, not only do you have to keep all of your invoices, you need to keep track of everything. You need to have a list of everything. Keep all your invoices that you paid, but you're also opening up the possibility of an audit from CRA, which we feel will be a lot less on the flat rate method, because the flat rate method just applies $2 a day. You don't have to keep a detail. So as long as you can prove that you worked from home, and in most cases with the shutdowns, the lockdowns, very few people were considered essential workers, and therefore very few people went back to the office and worked. So this completes my presentation. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions. Maybe before we get to the next, maybe if we can, Janine, bring up the form T2200.
Yep. So stopping the share. I think we're at almost at the limit of our the number of people who joined this meeting. So the T2200 is here.
Yes, so the T2200, if we look at this, this has to be completed by your employer. For those, this is a much more simple form for the year 2020. In the year 2019, there's 3 pages that the employer has to complete. In the year 2020, the employer has to complete the form, and there's only 3 questions that they have to complete. Did this employee work from home due to COVID-19? Did you or will you reimburse the employee for any of their home office expenses? And was the amount that you reimbursed included on your T4, on the employee's T4? So if box 2 is answered yes, then what will happen, you will have to deduct this amount from the amount that you are claiming as an expense. If box 3 is completed, it's already included on your T4. Now you have to see, was it included in your earnings? If it was included in your earnings, then you don't need to include this amount as a deduction because you've already paid tax on it. But this is the form that an employer has to complete. Now, it's not a complex form, but when you find companies or you have nonprofit groups or universities that have thousands of employees, the form becomes, there's a lot of forms that need to be signed off. So therefore, before you do ask them for the form, I would suggest that you do all your calculations and see if the simplified method is better for you. Now, Janine, if you can bring back up the form T77S. Now, if we go to option 2, which is the detail method, you can see it gives you a list on the side of what is eligible, what is non-eligible. But the list I've given you is even more detailed. So look at that one also. And now if you go down the page, please, Janine, you will see what the detailed method asks you to do. and it asks you for calculations for office supplies, other expenses, cell phones and so forth. And if you read under other expenses, it tells you employment use only. So I saw before someone had listed, how did I get 168 hours for hours in a week? I did 24 times 7. It's 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week. You live in your apartment even on weekends. So therefore the government says those 48 hours are still included in part of the calculation. So if you work 30 hours or 35 hours a week, that's why you have to do 35 divided by the 168. Now, if we go to that last document, Janine, the one with eligible and non-eligible expenses, I just want you to look at where it says home office supplies. Can it be claimed? If you go down, it gives you between salaried employees and commission. You're all salaried employees, so don't even look at the bottom part. And you start to see that very few amounts, if you go back up a bit, Janine, you will see that very few amounts say yes. They all say no. Webcam, no. Safe lock, no. If you just go up a bit more, please, you'll see that a couple of them will say yes, but they're very limited. I think we have to just go down a bit where it says computers, laptops, right there, we see fax machine. We are not eligible, but a commissioned employee is. Computer and laptop or tablets, the answer is no. So it's very, very limited as to what you are allowed as a salaried employee. So I'm open for questions, if anybody has any.
All right, Mike, thank you for the documentation. I would also like to mention to all participants that Mike has agreed that this session be recorded. So if at any point you had difficulty coming in, the recorded session is going to be posted on the MAUT website, in addition to all of the reference material that has been used today in the discussions. I just want to say this straight from the top. And I really want to acknowledge Mike for agreeing to this because it's going to simplify our lives. So Joanne, did you see questions that were coming back? Otherwise, I'll go through the chat.
Sorry, I was kind of preoccupied for a short moment there with people trying to re-enter the meeting, but
okay, so I'll go through the chat if you do that, manage people, and I will okay, presentations, recording. If our contract is part-time basis and we work from home the entire year, are we eligible for the $2 a day?
Definitely. This applies to part-time and full-time employees. So on the $2 a day for a part-time employee, it's $2 a day.
Okay.
If you're using the detail method, then your hours are much more restricted. So if you're a part-time employee that works 20 hours a week, therefore you have to do 20 divided by 168. Again, if you're a part-time employee, remember the 50% rule for a period of 4 weeks applies. So for 4 consecutive weeks, you have to have worked more than 50% of your part-time hours from home. That 50% rule applies to everybody. The only difference in everything is that the number of hours changes for you. So if you're an employee that works 20 hours a week, 11 of those 20 hours for a period of 4 weeks, 4 consecutive weeks, need to have been worked from home. If you haven't, you are not eligible. And then afterwards, if you've worked only 4 hours, that doesn't matter. You can use those 4 hours. But for 4 consecutive weeks in 2020, you must meet that requirement.
Thanks, Mike. Other question. Do we calculate 3 days a week even though we worked much more from home?
What do you mean?
So I think you gave the example of if you're working 2 days a week, then you're not qualified. But
no, my example was if you're working 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
If you work 5 days a week, and out of those 5 days, 2 days are from home and 3 days are at the office. The answer is you do not qualify. It's 40%. If you work 5 days a week, now I think most of you are salaried employees. So if you're salaried employees, the government will not look at the hours that you're working, but rather the number of days that you're working, because you're not remunerated if you work extra hours. You're paid for a work week of 40 hours a week or 35 hours a week. So therefore, you need to calculate it based on the days of work.
Mhm.
If you're a part-time employee and you're working 20 hours a week or 21 hours a week, then the answer is yes, use hours.
Okay. Another question from John. I understand that the denominator for the work hour percentage can be less than 168, typically using 90 hours of real available time.
I don't know where year when I see it as 168.
You see it as
I
168.
see it as 168. Last night, I was on the phone with a tax lawyer that we do business with for another matter, and I was telling him I was giving this presentation today, and he specializes only in tax. He's from a big law firm, and he agreed with me that the 168 was really the number to use.
Okay. Thank you very much. Question was, can two people working at the same home use the flat rate? I think you answered yes
Yes,
for
the
this.
answer is yes.
What are the eligible expenses? Do mortgage or house tax count?
No,
No.
and that's on that schedule. You'll see it, and it's also on the form 2200 that we saw.
Night hours are not usable hours.
No,
Going down. Interest on a mortgage.
no,
Slide 10 says internet accessible. Internet access is eligible. Slide 12 says connection fees not eligible.
what we mean by connection fees is if you call Bell to come in and put in a higher speed internet, they'll charge you $200 to put in the higher speed internet. Those are not deductible, but your monthly fees are deductible.
Okay, that's
So
good.
what I had to do, because now I'm having a lot of meetings, Zoom meetings, and my internet at home was not sufficient, I had to upgrade my internet, and I had to pay to have it a higher to get a higher speed modem and so forth, and them to come in and connect it. That would not be deductible. I'm not eligible for it because we're considered essential services and we've been coming to the office. But if I would be working more than 50% of the time from home, I would not be eligible for that expense.
Liliane says, so from March 19th to December 31st, 2020, that's equal to 287 minus weekends, so 205 days.
Yep.
Therefore, we can claim 200 max.
200 max. That's only if you have not gone back to the school.
Okay. Does this apply to graduate students who also remotely work part-time in the lab of professors?
Are they paid?
Yes.
They get a T4?
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Okay. Why?
Again, remember that this is called an employment expense. So the only way you can apply an employment expense is against employment income. So if you've earned income, the answer is yes. Now, if one of your graduate students earned $350 on his T4, he will not be allowed to $400 deduction. He's only allowed to a $350 deduction. You cannot put yourself in a negative amount.
Okay. Mike, another question is, how does the filing of this form work if I file personally versus electronically?
Okay, if you file personally, you mail it. Does this mean that they're mailed their returns?
I guess that's how
If
I'm
they
in.
mail their returns, they have to complete the form and include it with their tax return.
Okay.
If they're filing electronically on the government website or using one of the softwares that are available, they have to click into that form, because then that form automatically, when you put in your expense, that form will put the amount that form calculates for you on the line on the tax return.
Another, just wanting to reaffirm, so for a flat rate, do we still need a form signed by the university?
Definitely not.
Not.
The only thing you need to complete is the form T777, where you show how many days times $2.
You mentioned that children also are factored in. Can you provide details?
Okay, what I mean by that is that if you have children working from home and you have children who are doing the homeschooling, they were also using the internet. So therefore, you cannot justify that your internet expenses were all for you, for your office. You're going to have to use a percentage.
Okay. In the detail method.
In the detail. Again, this has only got to do with the detail method. That's why we are strongly advising all our clients to use the flat rate method. And because all our clients that are asking us about the detailed method, the calculation, it's very rare that you will have a bigger advantage than just the fact that a lot of people use service providers to do their tax returns. Whatever the extra amount is, I guarantee you, you will end up having to pay it to your service provider, even if it's a H&R Block.
If someone's situation changed part of the way, for example, they rented till August 31st, but bought a house on September 1st, does the calculation change?
Definitely. The $2 a day does not change. The calculation changes on the other one. You have to calculate the days that you were renting with the detail, and then you do your detail calculation on the other side.
Question, how are the hours calculated for a part-time faculty lecturer? Well, I guess the question is like, what's the difference between full-time and part-time? Is there anything we need to think about?
No, it's the actual hours that you're working.
Okay.
Now, some of you, excuse me, let's go back a second. If some of you have been working a lot of extra hours, and then now your work week of 40 hours, you may have to, if you put more. So what's going to happen, and we're a big group here, and I'm also going to be presenting to other big groups. What will happen is some people will say, I work 90 hours a week. And therefore, I should do 90 divided by 168. If the government picks out your file, and they might, because there's going to be a whole bunch of triggers that the tax returns will be picked up for audits, you will end up having to justify. So unless you have an agenda showing the hours that you worked in a particular day and be able to justify those hours, those 90 hours a week, the government might turn around and say, we're not happy with it, and we're going to use, you work a 40-hour work week, we'll use a 40-hour work week. So remember, even though you might work 60 hours or 70 hours, the government can always turn around on a detailed method and say, we don't. And we've had, in other years, because we don't just deal with just regular T4 people, we deal with commission employees, we deal with people that work from home. Even in my business, we've had the government come in and they say, Friday night, you have entertainment expense that you went out with a client on a Friday night. We don't go out with people on Friday nights. It's only for enjoyment purposes. And we tell them, but we're in business. So one of the things that a lot of our clients are fighting these days are when they go out on a Friday night or on a Saturday night with customers and try to pass the expense off as an expense. So if that is applying to us in business, imagine if somebody says, I work 90 hours a week. So it's 90 divided by 168. The justification is going to be extremely difficult.
That's good.
You have to remember the government employees, the fonctionnaires, they work 35 hours a week. They don't work an extra hour. They have a break in the morning, they have a break in the afternoon, and they have an hour for lunch. And when they're auditing companies, they have an hour to get to the company in the morning. And at night, if the workday finishes at 5, they're told that they can leave at 4 o'clock so that they can be home for 5 o'clock. So it's a very different situation from what you face as professors or in whatever you're working in, and what I face every day versus what the government faces, so the government employee faces. So when you have to try to explain it to them, some of them have problems. And what's going to happen, because this is COVID-19 has created all these programs, the government is going to hire a whole bunch of people that are not qualified. And therefore, they're going to be given a short course on what to look for and what to ask for. And will give you a lot of headaches if your file is selected for review. On the flat rate method, if you can just keep detail of when you actually worked from home, and a lot of cases are very simple. We have towers downtown that people were told that they could not come back to work, where that 10% of the people were allowed in the building. And when they would show up at their building the first time, only 4 people were allowed in the elevator or 2 people were allowed in the elevator. And everybody said, we're not going back.
So
That's easy justification.
at McGill, we had several emails where it was said that the working from home was prioritized. So probably keeping a record of this is a good idea.
Exactly. And therefore, the $2 a day method becomes so much more advantageous.
Okay, then we have, I lived in Ontario and worked from home there before joining McGill in August 2020 and then continued working from home. How is that good? How can I account for this? I guess this.
Where did you reside at December 31st? If at December 31st, you resided in the province of Quebec, meaning that you gave up your driver's license in Ontario and you took a new driver's license, well, you converted your license to Quebec, you got a Quebec Medicare card, and you lived in Quebec, you file a tax return in the province of Quebec, and you use, if you only lived in Ontario, it's simple, you only have the forms T777 and T2200. On Quebec, sorry, I did not give you guys the form, so I'll give it to you now. On Quebec, the equivalent of the T777 is the TP59-5-V, and the equivalent of the T2200S, which is what the employer prepares, is the TP-64.3.V. So if you lived in Ontario, you're just going to be filing the federal form and get your deduction there, because the federal government will give them a portion of that money to the Ontario government. If you're filing in Quebec, which we are the only province that has 2 systems, you will file both forms and get your credits on both of them.
Then we have, what % of internet access can I deduct, given that internet is also used for non-work related use?
Again, I would use the percentage of hours divided by the total hours in a week.
Will, with the flat rate method, you get a credit of $400?
Not a credit, an expense.
A deduction.
Employment expense. And it's the same with the detailed method. It's an employment expense. It's not a credit.
If we have been asked to work from home and mostly work from home, but occasionally come into the office, we can still use the $2 a day. I think that's
definitely.
Yeah. If we were on sabbatical for part of the year and would usually work at the office during our sabbatical, but we're working from home because the university was locked out, can we still claim the amount?
But usually if somebody is on sabbatical, that means they're not working, correct?
Well, they're still paid, actually.
But they're not working.
Yeah, so I guess that's what the question.
That answers your question. Are you working? The answer is no.
Okay.
Right? Because even, let's go back to the sabbatical quickly. If you're on a sabbatical, you're not going to the office anyways. So you're on a sabbatical, you're getting paid, but you're not working. So the answer is no, you don't get the $400. Like I don't get the $400. I'm paid, but I'm coming to the office. So I'm not eligible for the $400 expense.
Okay. How many hours are calculated per course credit? Okay, that's a McGill internal question.
Thank you, because I couldn't answer that one.
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, like some of them are McGill related questions. If we're on a sabbatical, you're working for McGill University conducting research. It can be at the office or not.
If you're doing work, if you're doing research work, again, then the answer is you fall into the calculation.
Yeah, I
But you
think.
need to keep track of the number of days.
Mhm. Who supplies the T2200 form? I think it will be McGill.
It has to be McGill. It has
and-
to be your HR department.
I would expect that, like all the tax forms that we normally receive, which are on Minerva, the T2200 is perhaps going to be available there, but that's definitely a question that I can follow up with the finance department and that Mike can't answer.
And the T777 is not McGill that furnishes it. You have to use the T777. So what I would suggest is if anybody is thinking of using the detailed method, go print out the form on the Canada Revenue website and fill it out to see if it's more advantageous for you to use the detailed method versus the flat rate method.
Can you mix detailed and temp and the detail method and the temporary flat rate?
No.
No.
The answer is no, it's one or the other.
Could you kindly repeat the names of the Quebec documents that we
Okay.
need to file?
So for the T777, the equivalent document is the TP, T as in Tom, P as in Paul, 59-3-V as in Victor. The equivalent of the T2200S, which will be the McGill that gives it to you, is the TP-64.3.V.
Okay. And now I've tried to go through the entire chat list. Is there additional questions that you would like to ask Mike? Please put it in the chat. And then I will wait a few minutes to see if there are remaining questions. If not, we will adjourn. Can the university refuse to supply the T2200?
In theory, the answer is no, because like Janine mentioned before, you got several emails telling you that you had to work from home. I know that they may try to encourage you to use the flat rate method if they've spoken to people like me. And what I mean by people like me is any professional. We are encouraging everybody to use the T20, the flat rate method. Number one, because of the audits, and we anticipate that the people that will be doing the audits of these type of expenses will be junior people, and they're going to be refusing. So I just want to take you through a quick process of an audit. In an audit, you'll get a letter stating that your file was selected for review, and please provide by mail all the original documents to justify your claim. So when they ask you to justify your claim, you will have to supply all your invoices for electricity, for heating, whatever you're claiming. You will have to mail it to the government. Then somebody at the government is going to go through them. Will then write back to you and say, well, we don't feel comfortable with this, and this. And you can try to win your case and try to settle with them. They may want to cut out certain expenses, and then you'll settle with them at a certain level. And if you don't, they will assess you. Once you get assessed, if you disagree with them, then you have 90 days to file a notice of objection from the time you receive this assessment. When you file that 90 days, then it goes into a different department. Unfortunately, I don't like to say this, but this is has been the reality in most of our smaller cases. People at the government in opposition will look at it and say, we agree with the assessor. So I'd say 90% of the cases will say, we agree with the assessor. So now you have to go to the next level, which is go to court, which will cost you a fortune. So, and a fortune of time, headaches, and you'll hate the government for it. So, and you'll just say, you know what? It was $400 deduction. It was $150 credit, net credit at my tax rate. I am not going to go crazy over this. And you lose it. While on the $2 a day or $600, whatever the amount is. While on the $400, I think it'll be a lot less of a headache through the government. I know that we sound as if we're really discouraging people. We are, because we work in this every day. And I keep telling people, if I had to do this all over again, I would. I'm an old man now, but if I was a young guy, I would have moved my family to Bermuda, because in Bermuda there's no tax authorities. I have no problem doing audits. I have no problem doing everything else, but dealing with the government is very nerve-wracking, which you don't have to deal with because you're salaried employees, but may have to deal with if you decide to use the veto method.
It's really nice. Thank you, Mike, for explaining the reasons why you're proposing one versus the other. We've come to the end of the hour, and I think thank you so much for sharing the documentation. We'll be posting everything on the MAUT website, and it sounds like you put in like a lot of work, Mike. So I hope other people get to benefit from your expertise.
Hope so too.
We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.